Welcome to the CDM workshop on workflows and business events. So this is a hybrid session with a room in London and a number of people joining virtually. So day one of the workshop, there are actually 2 days. And first of all, let's start with some logistics. Oh, sorry. Let's start with some logistics. So the workshop is being recorded. The purpose is to make the recording available to the people that could not join today, as well as to make the recording available to the people joining to go back and listen again some of the topics that are being discussed. Please put yourself on mute. This way there is no interference. You can raise your hand to ask questions, and then you can unmute yourself. And please try to wait until the end of the slide or the module before asking a question. You may also raise a question via the chat box. So I mentioned this is day one. There's actually a follow-up day 2, which is scheduled July 9, and it will be virtual only. So the purpose of the second day is to follow up on items that are going to be discussed in this meeting. Should there be any outstanding items, some follow-up items that need to be discussed, there's more information on day 2 at the end of the deck. So the workshop is brought to you by ICMA, ISDA, and ISLA. So the 3 associations sponsoring CDM, as well as FINOS and Renegotiation. So just a little bit of information about the trade associations. So the 3 associations, ISDA, ISLA, and ICMA, are collaborating on CDM, and they are sponsoring the work. FINOS is providing the repository. So this is the FINOS CDM. There's a slide about FINOS. So some of you may have seen that. It provides some information about FINOS, also, which is a nonprofit membership organization in the financial services, and some information about the FINOS CDM, which is a standardized machine-readable and executable blueprint for how financial products are traded and managed across the transaction lifecycle. So CDM is represented as a domain model and distributed in open source. So the speakers today will be myself. So this is Lita Grignavu from ISDA, and I will be the moderator today. Joining me will be Lionel Smith-Gordon from Renegotiation. Lionel is the head of client services, as well as Leo Labase, who is a CEO of Renegotiation. So the objectives of the session today is to learn the fundamentals of workflows and business events. So we will have a presentation on the current state, presentation given by Lionel from Renegotiation. And using the CDM business event model, firms will be able to improve interoperability, automate business processes, and also using CDM. So this workshop has been set up to provide an opportunity to ask implementation questions and discuss lifecycle event related issues. Also, we will address issues. We will look at issues with the existing event model and discuss new features and improvements that could be made. So the agenda for today is as follows. So I'm finishing the welcoming remarks, and the first session will be the current state of the model. So Lionel will lead this session, So this is scheduled for about an hour 15, perhaps an hour and a half. We will have 3 breaks. The first break will be 10 minutes after that first session. And in later, the second session will be about discussing the group feedback. So there has been some feedback that has been asked in advance from firms. So some certain firms have provided some feedback, and we are going to go through this feedback. So we have 2 sessions of 60 minutes scheduled with a break number between. So we'll play it by ear. So depending on how long it takes to go through the feedback, we may shorten or lengthen those 2 sessions. So the group feedback will be followed by the third break. After the break, we will have a roundtable giving the opportunity for firms in the webinar and around the table to voice any issues or concerns or suggestions that they might have regarding that they might have on the CDM workflow model. And then we will conclude the workshop with some next steps. So the target audience is essentially everyone. So prospective firms that are investigating CDM will be interested to learn about the current state of the event model. New users of CDM that just started implementing will be interested in perhaps refreshing their understanding of how business events and workflows work. And then the hardcore users of CDM, those that may be stuck with the model, or there are some issues that are preventing them from moving forward, or perhaps they're at the next level where they need more functionality. So those hardcore users will be able to ask the questions as well. So this is the agenda. And now let us move to the next point, which is the current state of the model. And Al is going to share his screen.
Let me make sure that I can speak first. How about if you mute that one, mute that speaker? Is that better? You just mute the laptop. Hello. Can you just turn that speaker up? Hello? Not the microphone. Let's turn off the speaker. I'll let you all look at me while we're waiting. For those of you who didn't make to this building, it's a wonderful British government concrete office building. You're missing a lot of high-tech sophistication. Not. Okay, is that better? I think that probably is. If I turn my speaker on here, then it can come out here if anyone speaks. Okay, how's that? So I'm assuming that you can hear, so everybody else can hear. Okay, I will assume that everyone can hear and that they will start shouting if they can't. Litek, thank you for the introduction. As described, we're going to go through an overview of the business and event model as it exists today. And in this session, we really want to give you a good fundamental understanding of the terminology, how the model is actually put together, why it was done that way, and also some of the rationale behind that. And in this presentation, we'll go into a deep dive into the design, and then we'll go through some specific use cases which demonstrate the events. So what is the objective of the model itself? If we reflect upon what the CDM is designed to do, and it's the difference between it and some of the predecessor models, for example, FPML, the business and event model is a key feature of the CDM, which is designed to give it significantly more power in terms of modeling business. And specifically, business and event model in the CDM is designed to standardize not just the way that contracts and products are represented, but all of the life cycle of events that take place upon trades and contracts across the life cycle, from execution to settlement and post-trade events. And in doing that, as we're all aware, I think that the CDM does represent that's shared across the community that's represented on the call today. Unambiguous. The idea is that there should only be only one way of using the model. And quite importantly, a machine readable representation of events. So it's both, in fact, human readable and also machine readable. And that through doing that, we can truly reflect the impact of events on the underlying contracts. What are some of the benefits of the model? There's quite a lot of words on this slide. I won't read them all out, but the standardization of events that occur across the trade life cycle. So within the industry, we can have a single understanding of what those events are across the different functions in our organizations. And through that, reduce ambiguity and ensure that we get less duplication across organizations. Improving automation and interoperability using those standards actually enable machine readable definitions, which can be used to automate workflows, leading to reduced processing and requiring less reconciliation. Regulatory and audit transparency with a complete audit trail of how a contract is changed through its life cycle, enabling us to comply better with regulatory frameworks. And clearly there's a strong connection here to the DRR. Modularity and reusability. So we will talk a lot about the concept of primitive events, which allow composition so that you can create more complex events from simple reusable parts. And in doing this, we can encourage reusability as products, contracts evolve over time, and potentially new products and new events are created. And lastly, cross-industry consistency, using the data standards, but also operational behavior, ensuring that consistency across different types of organization. And how does the model actually deliver these benefits? So it is a abstract and domain agnostic design, meaning that the business logic is separate from that defines the products, which enables flexibility and extensibility. Using an event sourcing paradigm so that we capture every state change as an event. It's also, as we all know, an open source implementation provided as Rune DSL code. And when it comes to implementation, platform neutral. So it can be actually implemented using code generators into different languages and systems. Litek, I assume you can see any chats or questions because I can't see them on my screen. So let me know if there are any. And importantly, we want to make sure that there's a good understanding from today's sessions about some of the design philosophy behind the event model. So I've already talked about standardization and composability and the importance of using the primitive event functions and how those can then be created into complex events for modular reuse. But it's also important to understand that it's a functional model following a functional programming paradigm, so that each event is defined as a function of a trade state with a primitive instruction. And we'll define both of those terms in some detail in the coming minutes. And as a functional model, this enhances traceability and determinism in how the business events are actually applied to the underlying contracts. So let's have a look at the structure of the model. We obviously have data structures, just like we do for products and contracts. And we have data structures specifically to model events. And we define a life cycle event as occurring when a transaction, a trade goes through a state transition, and that can be initiated by one or both of the trading parties, by the contractual terms, or external factors in the market. And here are some examples of the events that are supported in the model. Most importantly, perhaps trade execution and then confirmation related to that, where applicable clearing and allocation events, settlement events, including future cash flows, and the exercise of options. Those are just some of the examples. We will go through I think all of these in this presentation and some more as well. And on the right, I've given an example of how those events can interact together during the life cycle of a trade. And you can read through that blue box on the right, and you can see that obviously starting with an execution, potentially an allocation, maybe an amendment, and in some cases, in terms of an external event, a default would be an example on a credit-related instrument that would be an external event. So some design principles about how we represent life cycle events. So as we've just seen, the life cycle event describes a state transition. And in order for there to be a state transition, there should be a before and an after trade state. And it's the transition that we're recording between that before and the after. Those transitions are functional and composable, and the model has the functional logic to describe how that takes place using the building blocks that we'll take a look at. Using the trade state, the history of the trade state can also allow the state to be reconstructed at any prior point in the trade life cycle, so that we actually have the lineage of the trade through a sequence of events. It's important to understand that the product that is being traded remains immutable. So the product itself doesn't change, but we can have a set of events that do not alter the product, but take place on the specific trade through the life cycle. And because of that, the state is trade specific, not product specific. And as is often the case in these kind of models, a product may be associated to many trades, each with its own specific state between any two parties. I hope this diagram is viewable for those of you on the call. It's a little bit hard to see here in the room. But what this diagram is trying to illustrate is some of those terms I just talked about. So we have on, if I can draw, here we go. On the left, the trade life cycle with the before state and then an event applied to it, resulting in an after state. And then we look at some of the information that is related to each of these three. So for the before state, we obviously have the trade itself, which is in a product with counterparties and economic terms and the underlying payouts. We then have information on the business event, including when it was, identification information, and then right over here on the right, the primitive events. So these are the basic building blocks that I've talked about a few times now, and execution being one of them, reset, transfer, etc. You can see how those are assembled. So the trade goes through that life cycle of before, applying a business event, and then resulting in an after state. So I'm just trying to remove all those marks now. Doesn't want to do that. So how does we saw a little bit there how the event model interacts with the product model. Here's another representation of that on the right, again with the event model on the left hand side of the diagram with the business event applying primitive instructions to a trade state. And on the right, within the trade itself, there is a reference to the product model, which defines the underlying product, the economic terms, and the payouts. And then in some cases, the cash flows that are represented in the payouts may result in actual events themselves, such as a cash transfer. And that is represented in this diagram as the actual payment is another event. And there can be a history of those events as well. So looking at the state transition, the trade state represents, unsurprisingly, the state of a trade and can represent it at any point from execution through to settlement and maturity. And the concept of the primitive operator are these functional building blocks that are used to compose events. And each of those primitive operators describes a fundamental change that can apply to a trade. So at the top of this diagram here, we have the trade state structure. And as you can see, reading across left to is composed of the trade, the current state, and history on events such as resets, transfers, and observations. In the center of the diagram, the business event is a primitive instruction with a number of qualifiers. And then down the bottom, as I've said before, we have the trade state before and the application of that business event resulting in the trade state after. I see some chats flashing up. Any questions?
Interested. How does the develop to the only external mass while at sure it's that big remains the most
Okay, try and break that question down a bit.
as
Sorry, it was really hard to hear. I'm happy to talk through this question, or I just posted it to wait till the end to address it. I'm not.
Okay. Yeah, we just read it out and we weren't entirely sure of the number of your question. Maybe just hang on to it And if
Yeah.
after 2 minutes we still haven't answered it, just chime up again. Speak
Sure.
up. Thanks, Luke. Okay, so I just drilling into trade state a little bit more, and those items that I covered here. There's a model representation on the right of trade state showing how it applies to trades, which are themselves made up of tradable products. Looking at some of the attributes on the trade state data type on the left, we have the trade itself, including specification of the product, the trade lots, counterparties, and identifiers. Then we have the status information in state, and then those three collections of history, the rate resets, any payment and other transfer events, and observations, as it's written here, are key market events, credit events, corporate actions, etc. And then we also have the valuation history, tracking the valuation of the trade over time. Looking into a business event a little bit more. The business event representing a life cycle event that transforms a trade from one state to another. And here we have the key components. We have an instruction, which actually says what should be done. Then we have an event qualifier, the after state, and a date. Right, can't change screen. And we saw at the bottom of this diagram that the event instruction is made up of one or more primitive instructions. So let's have a look at what a primitive instruction is. So it's obviously a core element of the event model, and it is used to define the details of the actions that should be performed on a trade state. And there are a number of them defined within the CDM that are listed on the right here. So we have contract formation and execution, exercise, party change and quantity change, reset, split, terms change, transfer, index transition, stock split, observation, and valuation. And so I talked earlier about the concept of composability of events. And so these are the lowest level components that we compose events, business events from. As we go through today, and indeed probably the second day, there may be some challenge to this list. There may be some that participants feel shouldn't actually be in this list, or some other primitive instructions which could be in this list. So that's something that we may well discuss. So how do we then compose those primitive instructions into trade lifecycle events themselves? So we use a combination of those primitive instructions applying to a trade state to represent complex business events. So in the diagram at the top is showing creation as an execution, which creates a new trade, and then a contract formation, which has on the left structural changes, which can apply, split, party change, exercise, index transition, stock split, and then also trade maintenance activities, which could apply to that contract on the right: reset, quantity change, terms change, observation, transfer, and valuation. And then one other business event, trade termination. Or looking more in words at the bottom half of the screen, there are a number of trading lifecycle events: execution, allocation, clear trade, novation, some transfer events for both cash and security, or a combination, and then the lifecycle events on the right-hand side. I'll just pause there to allow people to digest this page. Tech, tell me if there's any questions coming up. So how do we go about creating business events? There are a set of functions, and those of you who've spent much time with the CDM will know that functions are one of the most powerful components of the model. So there are a set of functions which exist to create specific types of business events using these components that we've been talking about. So for example, the create execution function takes a new trade state from an execution instruction, and the create contract formation function transforms an execution into a legally binding contract. And this sequence diagram on the right shows a flow of activities starting with the create execution function, which takes an execution instruction, goes into the event model, that creates a new trade state, and that is then returned. The client then initiates a create contract formation using the trade state from the previous step and applying a contract formation instruction. The instruction is then used to transform the execution state, and then that returns a contract state. Later on in the life cycle, the client may perform a create exercise, another function, and that takes a state as an input and applies an exercise instruction that could result in processing the exercise of an option and again returning a new state. And a couple of simple code snippets down below illustrating what those functions look like. And in typical CDM style, it's a function definition defining the inputs. So for create execution, the input being the instruction and the output being the trade state. And then the next step on the right, the create contract formation, as I described before, takes an instruction of a contract formation instruction, applies it to an execution to result in a trade state, which is a contract formed. So now let's look at a different business event, which is a reset event. So these often occur for interest rate products when there are floating rates that need to be reset. So the diagram on the right, again, is a sequence diagram showing the trade state, the before trade state coming in. We then go through the business event to perform a reset, which goes through the steps of identifying which of the payouts needs to be impacted, finding the reset date, finding the market rate, creating a reset object, and then updating the trade state to show the after state, along with the reset history containing the details of the event that was applied. And there's some further explanation on the left that shows the function resolve interest rate reset, which is used to perform the items in the yellow box in the middle. And that takes the various components required in order to generate the upstate. Yeah, I agree. It's not a great presentation. Yeah. That line?
You hear you?
No. I'll try and be more entertaining. Let's have a look at another event, quantity change. Again, very similar sequence diagram on the right. And this showing the same sort of flow of an initial input and then the updated trade state coming out. And in the yellow box in the middle, the key of activities that take place in processing this business event, determining the change type, applying a new quantity and validating the result, and some of the functions that are used to perform these activities shown on the left: quantity increased, quantity decreased, and quantity decreased to 0 to ensure that the right sequence of processing is undertaken within the model to affect that event. Many of you who've worked with the CDM will be already familiar with the concept of qualification. Qualification is a method to identify how things should be reported and represented. So in the product model, rather than products being defined up front as being, for example, an interest rate swap, within the product model, we have qualification functions which examine the structure of a product and then qualify it as representing certain rules that define it, in my example, as being an interest rate swap. We have the same concept within the event model of event qualification, and the functions look at the trade state before and after, and the instructions, the primitive instructions that have been used to identify the business event. And here's some examples: qualify allocation, qualify cash transfer, qualify novation, qualify partial termination, which are functions which are designed to do those qualification of events. And the diagram on the right illustrating that as well, how that event qualification is applied after the business event has been processed. Let's move on to another topic, which is the one of workflow step. So what is a workflow step? It is really a way of representing multiple business events together. So as it says here, it's a top-level construct that includes the who, what, when, and how of business actions, acting as a wrapper around business event, providing the additional information about the action and the participants to make it usable in a real-world system. So it serves to connect actors and events, to add operational metadata, timestamps, and other information, audit trails, etc., and to bridge business intent and execution. So this actually, as shown here, I want to allocate this trade, and then the resulting information and transformation that occurs as a result of that intent. Here is a diagram, which some of you may remember comes from some of the very early work that was done by the teams on the event model a few years ago, that illustrates how the workflow step should be used. And so every time a contract changes, the business event, which as shown in the blue in the diagram, business event, as we've already discussed, is made up of a number of one or more instructions, which includes the primitive instruction and trade state before, that the business event then results in the trade state after, plus the extra information, event date, and qualification. So that's your business event. And then to make the workflow step, we wrap that with the timestamp and the status. Now, these steps can then be chained together to create a more complex history of all of the workflows that are applied to a trade through the life cycle. And if I remember correctly, the next page shows that. No, it doesn't. That's this one. I'll just go one step forward. So this is the concept of chaining primitive events. But so let's have a look at how primitive instructions can be applied. And this is the concept here of the sort of functional programming paradigm in the model of primitive instructions applying over trade states. So you've got this function down the bottom of it. What we've done here is we've effectively applied an instruction which has an input y to the before state x to result in an after state z or z. So we can write the primitive as a functional z is a function over x, the two input parameters x and y. I show this page because we'll go through in a few moments some more details on different use cases, as I said at the very beginning, and we'll reuse this view as we go through those use cases to demonstrate them. And as I said a moment ago, we can also, in that functional programming paradigm, chain together primitive operators to apply them. And for those of you who are mathematically inclined, you can get a composed function as shown here at the bottom of the diagram. As I said a moment ago, we're going to look through now some key use cases. So I have a number of slides to take you through those, but I'm just going to pause if there's no questions. Anybody like to ask any questions before I move on?
Sorry, I have a question. Is it possible that the set of the input to the business event result in ambiguous output? We don't exactly know which event, how to determine this event, or maybe multiple potential outcomes.
I said at the beginning that the model is designed to be unambiguous, so that shouldn't occur. So one of within that, as I understand it, and anybody here who can correct me, the event qualification process is designed not only as qualification, but also validation. Leo's nodding. So that if effectively your event doesn't qualify, then you have got an invalid state or an invalid sequence of events has occurred.
Thank you.
I lost it. I would eat the dynasty. Not the dynasty change, and the was quite by what the output is and get days of images. And that's take that first. Just time well, I'm sure you have that only YouTube, but that's actually the idea of using the two plans of events, something really those that otherwise by just very so you govern. Let's sit down.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Just going back on your reset slide on how that's implemented.
This one?
Yeah. So all of the other primitive instructions in the model kind of represent a change to get from a before to an after. So quantity change tells you the amount that you've got to change. Party change is the parties. Contract formation is adding in the contract details. Transfer is the amount and the asset and the direction. The reset instruction is just the payout and the reset date. And in your slide, it's talking about here the observed market rate, but that's not an input into that reset instruction. So I was just wondering how this is actually implemented in the model.
So I think it's correct to say that within the payout definition, there is a mechanism to define how the reset should be observed.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
when it says here, number 3, observe market rate, it's about applying that definition of how the observation should be observed and then going out and doing it.
Okay, so in all the other primitives, there's some form of calculation. So the transfer instruction, as an example, does the calculate transfer function, which actually is a calculation to determine or as an input into the primitive instruction. But reset doesn't have any form of calculation or anything. So what I'm saying is I guess the primitive instruction is telling you to go and do something in the future rather than doing something there and then in the case of reset. Maybe I'm not explaining myself clearly.
I think you are, Luke, but I think it is applying the reset is actually doing it at the time it occurs. Is your question really where does the actual reset rate get added into the...
I guess so, yeah. In the example and how it's currently modeled, the reset rate gets applied in the acceptance of the business event rather than in the primitive instruction. Whereas in all of the other cases with the primitive instructions, the whatever needs doing to the trade is always calculated or defined up front in the instruction. Whereas reset, it seems to be in a post process.
Okay. Can we note that? And we can look into that and perhaps discuss it later this afternoon or in the next session.
Sure, I have some slides as well to describe this.
If you send them through.
Just what historical was pretty well first of the see quite specific the city was story and therefore stabilizes since the model has evolved all on the plan is but also other aspects however both those concepts that have since been rationalized that the local energy products was
okay.
Definitely, I'm surprised part of the feedback that we receive from you and from others is really good. And it's also been raised in based on the review of there is some discussion as well.
Sure.
Maybe we should have said more explicitly up front in the purpose of this presentation wasn't to lay down the law and say this is how it is and it's right. This is just how it is today. And I think one of the key reasons to have this workshop is to gather feedback from participants about areas that are not potentially right or that need more explanation or more work. So thank you for that, Luke.
Sure. It's now a good time to explain my first question.
Go on then.
Imagine a world where you have a system that's processing these events internally, and triggering them internally. When you receive an external and the trade is going through its life cycle, and as you've said, you're appending information into that trade state, so things like reset history or transfer history, etc. So imagine you have this representation of the trade which has got all of this history in the trade state. When you receive an external event for, I don't know, an increase or a decrease, what thought has gone into applying that event to the most recent trade, so you end up with an CDM object which represents the change, but also has all of the history that's happened in the past.
Do you want to have a go?
Leo, it's quite hard to hear you because I think you're quite a distance from the mic.
I think it's fair to say that at this point, this is probably not an area that has been given too much thought.
Anna?
So Luke, over to you to make sure that it gets thought in the next.
No problem.
Anyone else?
Yeah.
They probably can't hear you. Are you on Zoom? Just unmute yourself.
So I really
ahead.
I really like the slide on the sort of cumulative function, but the way that you displayed the past states and the operations. I guess a fundamental design question in that with workshops like this, we expect the model to be dynamic and evolving over time. If the state n is always dependent on the state n minus one, does that give rise to any inherent design risk in that if you want to capture something new as a result of development in the model, how do you integrate that into either the operation or the previous state to make sure it gets captured in the next state? If there's a new data element for a different type of product or something like that, how does that get captured? Is that the operation, the primitive event's responsibility to include that for the target state? Or would you go back and enrich the previous state to make sure it gets included, evolve?
I think that's another good question that I don't feel qualified to answer, but I'll open it up for anybody who's got a view. Ian, you're nodding.
Or is that primitive event in itself?
Model upgrade or
Absence
instead of needs to be included to the entry rate.
Tom, I can see you've got a hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the relative to maintaining the history of events. What we've done, because we have a whole life cycle of repo events and other things that take place, we've really implemented or adhered to a more disciplined model whereby you need to have workflow structure and you can have work branches of workflow. Workflow steps, instead of going directly from an external input directly to a business event, if you maintain a discipline around external events going through workflow and workflow steps, then you can maintain the structure of things that take place all through the workflows. And so that would be things that like resets and anything that comes along, you can structure those and have a structure that expands by putting together a number of workflow steps. That's one. I'm just saying, as maybe this requires more work, as I even have a number of notes on this in terms of how it could be improved, but that's one way that I've gone about keeping the history of events.
Tom, and maybe that's something we can get, if you've got some materials on that, we could get onto the agenda perhaps for the next session.
Yeah, certainly. We've done this through a number of steps that we've had a number of implementation working group sessions that have gone on, and some fairly complicated around pairing trades that would have changes in settlement and transfer and things of those sort. And so that things don't all of a sudden branch out without any links between what's taking place. Basically, it involves, and I can share some presentations on this in terms of how the workflow steps get put together.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Mr. Martos, you have your hand up. No? Okay. All right, I shall continue on in my agenda.
Excuse me. Can you
Yeah.
hear me now?
Now I can, yes.
It was me. Sorry. I was just wondering, given that answer, maybe what we need to provide, or we need to ask FINOS to provide, or ISMA, all the associations provide guidelines on how to extend the event model effectively. So we make sure we are not creating new events or we are representing external events that effectively override the existing ones.
That's a good point. Any other questions? And otherwise I'll start moving through the use cases. Okay, number of slides here on different use cases, starting with allocation, which of course is the process of taking a single trade and breaking it into sub trades for either internal or client reasons. And the implementation here is using a split primitive, several quantity change primitives, and the party and contract formation instructions per resulting leg, so that each new leg can optionally carry distinct information. And I think I've got a diagram of this. Yes, I do. So here we have the primitive function in the center of the screen, the create split primitive. And within that, we have the primitive function create quantity change, create party change, create contract formation primitive, and also then the quantity change primitive, which is applied. So what we've got here is the original trade being split using these new create functions, which put the right amount on each of the splits, put the right party on each of the splits, and then the original trade getting the right amount on it. Don't think I explained that very well. Any question on this slide? Dan?
Yeah, late joiner from the West Coast. When an allocation is done, is the original trade, a few questions, is the original trade torn up, or is that up to how the parties want to allocate?
That can happen.
Okay, so it's up to the parties.
Yeah, and the lives even it's it's okay.
Okay.
Then yes, run that well.
Okay, and the checking to ensure that the notionals on all sides add up, is that done as part of the allocation execution, or is it expected that the inputs make sense?
I'm not sure off the top of my head, but I'm check this. Well, that's how it meant. Provides validation check that's the right note.
Okay. And lastly, again, apologies, I'm joining late, so this may have been answered already. Allocation, there was a allocation enum that went away. Does this imply it's now back as part of the asset refactoring? I remember there was an allocation event enum that went away because it was deemed that it wasn't being used.
There was definitely a confirmation that we did away with. I don't remember allocations specifically, but
I might be wrong.
Yeah. You remember what was it?
I'll go back to the asset refactoring documentation. I thought allocation went away, but maybe I'm wrong.
I think it was confirmation, not allocation.
Okay. Apologies.
No, I could be wrong.
Park that for when we get to confirmation.
Okay, so that's the allocation. We move on to a use case of clearing. And as it says here, this is modeled as a case of novation with the CCP being involved. and it generates up to 4 new trades. So the original trade is split. The beta and gamma legs are allocated effectively to the CCP and clearing brokers. It includes optional party changes, and this is designed to align with the CCP specific operational model. And one assumes that it works, as one of the publicly announced users of the CDM is the JSCC. I'm sure this is a key function that they're using. Here is the diagram that explains the primitive function create split and primitive, which is applied. We have on the left side between 2 and 4 new trades. If there's no clearing broker, there will be 2, otherwise it's 4. And then, as before, the original trade on the right is also updated. I'm just pausing to allow this to digest and see if there's any questions coming up. Okay. Looking at novation, and this is the business process of replacing one counterparty with another for all or part of a trade. And it includes 1 split primitive breaking the original trade, and 2 breakdowns, 1 with the full novation and 1 representing the remaining legacy trade in the case of a partial novation. And the diagram here, this quantity change taking place on the left-hand side, and then again the original trade right on the right as before.
With this, when you have 2 afters in there, they represent 2 trades effectively, one with the old counterparty,
Yes.
and then the second with the third counterparty put in or replaced. How do things like, first of all, then that's one business event that represents both of those trades. And then when you move the second one forward in further trade state updates, what's the intended behavior there? And also a follow-on question, there's trade specific information in that after or the before, which is things like a trade ID or something. And does that information then get replicated across both those afters, even though they're 2 different trades now?
This question on the question, because on the branch where gets change primitive requires specify the if you concentrate on so you pay with
Okay. Yep, makes sense.
I looked at the second question. I apologize, I missed the one.
The first one is really you've then got one business event that represents 2 trades between 3.
What is an event that represents 2 outputs of 2 trades? But the trades can then have their own life cycle subsequently.
But they're both in the wrapper of one business event. So what's the intended behavior to then take the after that represents counterparty 1 and counterparty 3? How do you then move that forward?
Those 2 outputs on top of that starts applying.
Okay, so you would take the after and then place it as the before and run a primitive on it. Fine.
Yeah.
On the 20 question was asked, but we well instructed to get only one innovation essentially distinguish just to get the annoying winners. So that's one of those where well we don't want could but that's where actually the initial information that's that use yeah it's that innovation but that's actually that was okay and this without amnesty not war because last
Glasgow, question perhaps. I noticed on the clearing slides, the qualifier was allocation, but it seems it should be more in line with novation, right? In as much as yes, sir. So on the clearing slide, I think if memory serves correct, the qualifier was allocation, which, however, given that you're going to result in upward of 4 legs from 1, the sum of the notional parts is going to be greater than the original trade, right? So doesn't that bring some referential integrity issues in allocation? Would it be better to use a form of novation? Or I'm just curious why that decision was made to use that qualifier. Allocation on clearing. Yeah, I think that's what it said.
that was not relevant maybe suitable by regulars. That's the brains that we are about to change and also our mechanics it's using and it's data it's going well they are distinguished
And is that right? Search. We get to it. Yeah. Is there a way of delineating that up front then when you're performing the allocations or qualifiers, whether you're saying, look, we expect the outcome to be the sum of the original leg, or we're not in the case that it's a clearing operation?
The shot has the best no, that's good. Position like that you have to take. Sure. I mean that's
Sure. I was just thinking about the earlier question. I'm thinking that would be helpful, but it's visible, right?
You're George. Okay, thank you. That just explains why George was appearing on my screen and speaking. Okay.
Sorry to interrupt, but I'm one question on innovation. So in case of stepping innovation, and you explained about stepping out of partial, but how about the stepping innovation for the stepping in party? So do we have a separate event type of primitive instruction, and is it dealing at innovation only?
A step in novation. Is there a separate event type for a step in novation versus a regular novation? I think is the question.
Yeah.
I will from the because if you just look on actually it's
Okay.
So I think on some of these more detailed questions, if people have got specific concerns like that, which they're not comfortable with, if you could write them up and send them through to LITEC, we'll make sure that in the second session that we've got more definitive answers for them to the extent we can.
But in this case, we will not have the stepping in party, we will not have a split details. So that's why I was wondering, is there a separate instruction that we need to give to create the business event? Okay, so we can take it part of data.
I think phrasing first really thinking about that know which shots it is on the perspective which shots and with FC or battery styles. This is the event different view. Is that what you are asking? Yeah,
Okay, maybe I'll send a question via chat. Maybe we can discuss tomorrow. Is that
Okay.
to see?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks, Robert. It's not actually going to be tomorrow. It's going to be in approximately 2 weeks when we have the second session.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
Okay, moving now on to quantity change. There's an illustration here of a quantity change primitive instruction. And in the yellow box, the qualification logic, looking to identify an increase, a partial termination or decrease, and a full termination, which is then computed through the process. And then we have the business event representation on the right with the output trade state in the after trade state. Okay.
Sorry, just go back.
Yes.
Quantity, and this could be used as termination also.
That's right, because as you see, bottom, the state is terminated. Yes.
And then even in case of amendment, if you are amending a notional quantity, that goes in the quantity chain. Also, if you're partially terminating, even partial termination, in certain other classes, we call it as decrease or increase, quantity change in equity. But whereas in non-equity, we use it as amendment, probably all of them will go on the quantity chain. Partial termination, full termination, or increase or decrease.
Yeah, all as a quantity change. Yes.
Right.
I have one question, Len, Alston here. But quantity change, say, for example, if I had a quantity change event for an FX, say, forward, wouldn't it be the same if I did, say, for example, we're just trying to represent trader who just updates the notional. And if I create a quantity change and I put in the direction as being a replace, then I don't need to do the partial termination, right, for just a quantity change, because the end result would still be the same.
Yes, a risk position points.
No, because if it's just an update, you're still having the same trade ID, the same trade event. It's just that it is still the same trade. It's just that you've bumped up the notional. And so I can see if I create it the same way, I can see that it does qualify as an increase because I'm just say doubling the values for argument's sake. And what happens is if I just put a quantity change, then it creates two lots of the same trade. And that's not the intention. The intention is it's still the same single trade. And so when I made it as a replace the direction instead of increase or decrease, I can see that the event is still labeled as an increase. It's just that I get the desired output. It's just that I'm not following the route of creating partial termination.
Yeah, both describes single class and all that singing.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. If no more questions, we'll move to compression. What do we have here? Stuff going on in this example, yes. Do you want to say anything? I'm not sure.
And most of we saw earlier, you are always starting from a secret instruction, which is a simplified state, to which you potentially apply multiple privileges. But compression is one of those stages where, in fact, the number of trades going in is multiple. Each have their own primitive instructions attached to them. So effectively, you have a number of trades going in You're going to get a number of trades coming out where the original trades are in fact terminated, and you're going to have new trades coming in. So that's an example of business events. Just to be real, we have no
People are saying you should sit nearer to me. Tom, you raised your hand.
Yeah, this is actually just a general comment. I just maybe to avoid any confusion, Lionel, I just want to maybe be clear that what you wrote, what you've been writing there on the presentation, which appears to be the function name, like create quantity change primitive is not actually part of the function name. So unless something has changed, the primitive is create quantity change. There is no specific function that uses primitive as a suffix.
Yeah, these were materials that came from slightly aged decks, so they may be incorrect in that regard. So you're basically saying that there should be a space. The function is create quantity change, and it's a primitive event.
Correct. It's a minor note, but if anybody was trying to match these up, it appears as a function name, but it's really create quantity change, not create quantity change primitive.
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah.
I think somebody else has their hands up. Dan?
Me. Yeah. This is post compression or compression submission? I'm assuming it's post compression. Right. The
business event is how you go from before to after. So it's both. So initially what you're going to have is a set of trade states, and effectively what is being proposed is that those trades are terminated and replaced by new ones. And once the compression is accepted by all of the compression participants, then that business event becomes reality and the trades get terminated and you get the after. The business event represents the transition from one to the other.
Sorry, apologies, still confused. So when the parties who are going to participate in the compression want to submit their trades for compression, is that happening in the create business event, or is this all after the compression is run and this is the outcome for the compression?
Yes, the latter. Because submitting a trade for compression, that's something that happens, I guess, bilaterally between each participant and the provider of the compression service. But that's right outside of that,
Okay. So compression's been run, and now it's up to the parties to accept what the outcomes are. Ideally, they should have accepted. They should automatically accept. And this is the event. These are the events that take you from you submit it after how you reduce your portfolio, the actions to reduce your portfolio. Okay, thank you. Sorry, one more stupid question. With all of these, as you're going through, can we highlight where it's actually in use today, or we're aware that it's actually in use today? So in the case of compression, is JSCC using this to allow compression or to force compression of cleared trades, or is it built and prospectively for use?
So I think we have to define what we mean by implemented. What I can tell you, so it depends on whether by implementation, we say we are able to consume those events and use them for some other processes, in which case the answer is yes to all of the events that have been shown and more, because they are all being consumed by DRR, for instance, and DRR routinely consumes compression and has to report those compression events as such. But if the question is there a provider out there that actually provides the compression service or provides the clearing service based on an internal CDM mechanics, then that's more a question to the provider than That's not necessarily information that we have.
Okay, I have one more slide.
Just to go forward, I'm sorry, I think what you're saying is that in order to properly report, all of these events need to be supported in a fashion. They're arguably after that they've occurred, and the question of whether they're being used to realize the actions themselves between the parties, that's open. Is that fair?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I have one more slide, which is the final use case, which is renegotiation. So I'll let you look over this one. And I think there was a question earlier about sharing this deck. There's obviously quite a lot of detail in here, and we absolutely will share the deck afterwards. Between this session and the one in 2 weeks' time, if people have further questions, you should write them up and send them through to LeTech, and we can spend more time in the second session on those. But I think LeTech, I need to pass back to you for the rest of today's exciting session.
Sorry, can I just ask one more question, having joined late? Was there a discussion about the current, whether if you have a series of events that have happened, you have a lot of before and after states? If that's correct, then you get a pretty hefty set of objects over time. Is there pruning that happens? So my first question is that correct? Imagine I've run a series of events over the life cycle. Now, arguably, I have a lot of before and after. I have a lot of before, really.
I think that's this is really an implementation concern rather than a model concern. However, if you look at, effectively, you're going to have lots and lots of objects where the content is going to be the same. However, probably the heaviest part of any trade object is going to be the product definition, because that's where you're going to most of the attributes. And that's where an efficient implementation can rely on the fact that the CDM has abstracted away the product definition so that you may reuse exactly the same product over and over, even when certain other parameters change, whether it's the parties or the quantities, etc. So that means that as an implementation, I can make that efficient, which means I'm going to have to store a lot of before and after information, but the heaviest part of my trade object, I can make sure that I don't have to duplicate that.
So just putting this back, that the suggestion is essentially store before and after field updates, not entire trade updates. Stupid question, right? Let's say the coupon changed from 3 to 4 on a interest rate swap. Is the suggestion we would store that there's an option to store just the before fixed rate and the after fixed rate, rather than storing the entire before trade and the entire after trade?
I'm not trying to make any, but all suggestion of implementation, because ultimately it's up for every implementer to decide. But in that particular case you mentioned, all of your swap definition is exactly the same. Only thing that really changed is a price. And that the CDM makes efficient by saying, I don't have to go and change stuff inside the product. It's exactly the same product. All I need to do is an amended price and quantity. And if I've done my implementation efficiently in terms of, I don't know, the way I'm setting up my database or whatever, then it means I'm not going to have to store that twice. I'm only going to store it once, and all I need to store is really the price that has changed.
Okay. Yeah, it comes an interesting question, because that means that you need, and this may be out of scope for this conversation, it means that you would need to like assemble a series of events to know the current state rather than directly know the immutable current state. But okay, thank you.
Thanks, Dan. I think you're on mute, but
Right. Let me try to take over. So that was a very good discussion. We are running a little behind, but that's fine. There's a lot of buffer built into the agenda. Next, we have the presentation on the group feedback. But before that, we have a break, and let me check the time. So it is 2:48. Let's start a couple of minutes before 3 p.m. Let's start at 2:58. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so we're going to start again. 60 seconds to go. All right, it's 2:58, 9:58 a.m. on the East Coast. Let's start the next session, which is group feedback. So this session will last for 60 minutes. And what we'll cover in this session is essentially, we'll present the feedback that we received from multiple firms. So from the community. So we received feedback from users of the CDM. So the issues ranged from pain points, questions, gaps, wish list, and suggestions. So we're going to go through this feedback. And for this, we are going to start first with one company. So we're going to start with feedback from TradeHeader, and then we're going to move on to feedback from other firms. For that, I'm going to switch to a Word presentation, a Word document that I have, and that Word document contains the feedback received to date. Let me scroll to the feedback from TradeHeader, and oops, and my this. And so we received around 4 questions from TradeHeader. And I was wondering if someone from TradeHeader would like to take the lead. So there was a question on the use of proposed event, next event, and business event.
Yes, I can maybe summarize the issue and then maybe my colleagues can jump over if there's any point that they find missing. Yeah, on this one, we were interested on discussing regarding the existence of this proposed event, next event, and business event. As under the workflow step type, there are...
Hang on, Georgina, sorry.
Yeah, apologies.
Sorry, go ahead.
Great, thank you. So yeah, we basically wanted to discuss regarding the existence of these 3 attributes of the workflow step. As below the workflow step type, there are several conditions regarding the existence of these attributes. So as you can see in the here in the middle of the screen, in the code part, we have a condition that it is called the workflow step status, that it restricts the existence of some of them depending on the other ones. For example, in the first one, we can see that if the business event exists, then the next event must be absent and the rejected must be absent. And the same with other conditions. So we wanted to discuss with the group and ask which was exactly the definition of each of these attributes and which was the usage, more especially on the next event, which is one that we are particularly interested on representing the next status of the business event, and also to discuss the coexistence between them. So for example, as we can see in the second line, we can observe that if we have a next event with an instruction, then the business event must be absent. We wanted to clarify the proposal of each of these attributes and also clarify if these conditions had a clear objective and which was that one. Maybe anyone from my team wants to add something here.
Georgina, I honestly I don't know in which context next event is actually used. Actually, your question reminded me of the existence of that attribute, but I didn't even remember it existed. In which case, I would even raise the radical question: is anybody using that? Are we using it in the context of GRR? I'm not sure.
We're using it.
Sorry.
We're using it in our implementation. Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. And so to do what?
Determine what the next event is and use it in the follow-up process for scheduling a next event. I don't know if this is why Georgina's raised this on our behalf or if this is separate too. I don't know.
Yeah, so it's something actually that we discussed internally that we wanted to clarify because, as you were saying, look, if we had this use case where we are representing the subsequent status in this next event, I guess that in that case we would have a next event existing and also a business event. So we would make this condition. Okay, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
So the definition for the attribute next event in the model is the intended next event can be specified even if the instructions are not known yet. Is that you have the context of the definition in the model?
Okay. Could be wrong, but I have a suspicion that this was originally put in for clearing purposes. So if you have basically you have an execution and it's already effectively like announcing that its intent is to clear and therefore it has the next event. But I'm not sure the implementation of that particular attribute has been very thought through. So if it's causing issues with the condition that you reported, Georgina, I think we should challenge whether that's actually relevant in the context of the CDM or whether it should not be rather an implementation concern that handles what the next event would be. So no clear answer to your question other than to me it suggests that maybe we need to rethink that element.
Yeah, thank you, Leo.
I think I'm thinking out loud here, but look, in what case do you always have to specify what is going to be the next event?
Yes, we aim to this in order to automate the post-trade. We're determining what the next event is at the previous step. And so we calculate what the next event is on the proposed event. And then to Georgina's point, when we accept that proposed event, we want the next event to carry through. So it's in the output.
Where people
Ian, it's really hard to hear you.
His last point was that if we just feel that it's an issue with the condition that's on the screen, then we can fix the condition.
Sure. I'm talking from my perspective. I don't know if Georgina has any other use cases for this. I'm not sure.
No, I think actually that was the one that we discussed. Yeah.
I see Tom has his hand up. Yeah, I don't have a comment specifically on the condition, but, and this may go off or part of a later discussion. Because one of the issues, and this goes to a little bit about how I've tried to implement the next event process, is that capturing the workflow at the moment is mostly a post-event process, right? You piece together the workflows of things that have happened. An event took place, a business event took place, and then you put it into the workflow step, and then you piece the workflow steps together. What I've tried to implement is actually more of a business process model whereby the workflows are predefined. Maybe as it related to what the comment was, you want to know after one step has taken place what your options are for the next steps, as opposed to not knowing and then piecing them together. So if there's a discussion about maybe how next event fits, my bigger discussion and topic that I was going to introduce was about being able to predefine the workflows whereby things like next event and so on would be optional depending on what the workflow actually would allow. And this gets to maybe a bigger issue about integrating, which I know some firms have looked at integrating a real business process automation model with the CDF. That's why I don't know whether this is going to become probably a bigger discussion. It's certainly a much bigger effort, but whether anyone, this was one of the topics I was going to bring up today in terms of the use of the workflows and workflow steps.
Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I'm sorry. And this may have been, if this was covered in the earlier session that I missed, please let me know. What's the distinction between proposed event and next event? And for that matter, business event. Business event, I guess, is the thing we're processing now. Next event and proposed event seem related. Proposed event could become a next event. Like I said, if it was covered earlier, then it's my bad. I'll catch up.
It wasn't covered earlier.
Okay, could we just take a brief second to orient those of us who are naive or uneducated or more?
I can speak from our perspective. We're using the proposed event as it's a proposal to change the state of a trade. The business event is the output of that. So it's the proposed event, which is the before trade state plus the change that you want to make. We're using the next event to determine what the subsequent event is. So for example, the proposed event may be resets, which would then mean that the next event is or would be a transfer, for example. So the proposed event would be a reset. The business event would be the accepted reset event, and then the next event would be the transfer. We would use that to build the automated process of the workflow steps.
So can I just play that back? That was proposed event is, I'll put in quotation marks, negotiated. Once it's accepted, it becomes a business event, and next event is used to chain. Is that fair?
We don't use the next event for anything more than just determining what the next event should be. We use the previous workflow step to chain everything together. The next event is hard because it has the option for fully defining what, all the parameters of the next event, but in some events you don't actually know, or you can't calculate what those parameters are until the day itself. And so we're only using a subset of the next event to just tell the platform what the intended behavior is or future behavior is.
But if you're using before state to chain, that's after that's after. And meaning you're chaining after it's already happened. And I don't mean, so I think I heard you say that you use the before state as the chaining mechanism, if I understood that correctly.
No,
That's after.
No, so we use the proposed event has a before and an instruction. So that's the before state, and then you apply the instruction to it. And what I said is we're using the previous workflow step. So it's the whole workflow step. If you look in Rosetta, you'll be able to see the structure. And the previous workflow step is just a way of putting reference to a previous object. It's probably easier to put this on a slide. Yeah, it references the whole workflow step, not just the before.
Luke, I have a question for you, if I may.
Yep.
Are you using several workflow steps that are, let's say, joined together that could span multiple business events? So effectively through the life cycle, or is it one set of workflow steps for one business event?
Yeah, it's one workflow step for, yes, it's, you have a proposed workflow step, and then you'll have a accepted workflow step of a business event. So that's two workflow steps that would describe one business event, one event. Event is used too much in this context. And we use our platform to actually string those all together, and we populate references to them in the previous workflow step. So you've got the lineage between each step in the life cycle of the trade.
Yeah, makes sense.
The next event we don't have a separate workflow step for. It's just part of the proposed, and we want to follow it through into the business event itself.
Just a thought for later about this next event thing, but I'm not sure this was designed in the right way where the next event belongs to that business event. Because the reality is that once you've executed the business event and you have the after, then whatever is in the after trade stage should be able to tell you what should be the next one. So it's not a characteristic of the previous business event, it's just a characteristic of the current state of the trade. I know what my next event should be. So maybe that's something that we need to think about.
Sure. So how was it meant to, so to Georgina's point then, how was it meant to be used?
And I'm not sure this was so true at the time. I think it was developed in the context of clearing, I believe, a long time ago, and I don't think it was thought out that much. But it's very interesting that you're now making use of it. So maybe we have to rethink of maybe a better way of doing this. Anyway,
Sorry.
but it's very useful to know that you are making use of it.
Yeah, just a comment that not all workflow steps don't require a business event, which is a positive thing in the sense that since business events require trade events or after state, like if you have an after state that requires a trade, but if you have workflow steps that you're doing that are not changes in the trade or not business events that you execute in the CDM, this gives you the capability of including workflow steps and saying, this is the proposed step, or this was the next step, or this is the next step that took place. So there's a positive aspect to this, that you don't have to have a business event or trade, which would have before and after. You could just include events as needed, but there's work. I think there's a lot of additional enhancements that could be done there, but I think that does, if I interpret it or use it as it is designed, whether it was intended or not, it does give you this capability of linking other workflow steps together that may not involve changes in trade state.
How are we doing on these questions?
Yeah, so our idea was to discuss regarding the next event. I think that we may need to do a bit of further analysis with it, with the feedback that we have received from the group. And maybe, as Leo was saying, to rethink the idea of this next event. As Leo was saying, it's right that we are only using it for clearing. To point out, the intention is to clear the trade when we have a new one. And the next point that we had to, also before jumping to the cancel, there was here also a point that is regarding positions, because as support was added in the model for positions, it was created a new counterparty position business event. And we were wondering if this condition should also apply to this counterparty position business event. This counterparty position business event was a type that is analogous to the business event that we have for trades, but for the case for positions. So this is why we thought that maybe this condition, if we rethink the concept of the next event and we date the condition, if we may need to also add some constraints on the counterparty position business event. That would be similar to the ones that we have now for the business event. So we think that probably same kind of condition should apply.
Yeah. Actually, it's part of the question I filled it, so we'll probably cover that later. But I remember we've developed that counterparty position business event specifically in the context of EMEA reporting for ETDs. And at the time, it was done in a way that we all recognize, okay, that's a tactical way of doing this just for the sake of reporting. But we have the fact that we have those two structures in parallel and they are not necessarily aligned, as I said, with the condition, is something that will need to be looked at. Because ideally, the way they should work should be exactly the same.
Exactly, yeah. That was our view too. Yeah, also we are aware that we think that primitive events haven't been implemented for positions, so they cannot apply to a counterparty position business event. So maybe the discussion to include this update on that condition to support positions may need to happen at a later stage once we have that support for events.
And you had something about relaxing also some condition, I think.
Yeah, was it the issue that we just opened?
Yeah, I don't know, Georgina, if you want me to maybe expand a little bit more on this issue.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, we raised this issue because we were taking a look at the representation of the workflow step. In this case, it was because we wanted to represent also like the proposed event to then complete this chain of proposed event and then accept the proposed event to have the business event. And we just saw that this condition, like the one that is in the white box, seems to be there to ensure that you have the counterparty position business event and the business event, but not both at the same time, which makes sense because we think it like to differ the trades from the positions as you were saying, but this choice is a required one. So this means we need to select one of these elements each time we use the workflow step. But as I was saying, we want to represent the business event and the proposed event as a separate workflows. And when we were representing the proposed event, we don't want to include the counterparty position business event or the business event. But if we're following this condition, we need to do that. That's why we just raised this issue, because the expected behavior for us is to have a required choice between the business event and the counterparty position business event and the proposed event. So we can ensure we can represent the proposed event as the proposal and then the business event as the acceptance of this proposal, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I don't know what you think. I think this was presented by Manuel in a working group, just to hear your feedback too.
Was it presented already? No, I don't remember this one. At least I know it was at the agenda at some point. I don't know if we went through it already. But yeah.
Yes, can you scroll down later, please, to the consequences of the change? Yes, here. No, just at the end of the comment. The section above. Yeah, so this would be the impact on changing. So the proposed solution and the impact on changing. What we want is to verify in this group whether this is the expected behavior for the three objects: proposed event, business event, and counterparty position event. And when the workflow step instances would be valid in terms of CDM validation.
Yeah, I think it's backward compatible by the look of it. You're relaxing a condition. And Manuel, can you remind me, did you present that in one of the working groups? I don't remember that we discussed the details of this issue.
Yeah, it was presented, but there was not many participants in that call. So it is planned to be follow up on the next contribution review session.
Okay, that's why. Okay. Was there anything else on trade headers list? Oh, yes, cancellation.
Yeah, we had one last point regarding the cancellation. This was already discussed as there was a function in DRR that we wanted to contribute it to CDM. We aimed to create an accepted workflow step, which was canceled. And in that point, we had some discussions and we agreed that an accepted workflow step cannot be canceled. So the only stage where we can execute a cancellation is when we have a proposed event. So then if we cancel a proposed event, we will stop the workflow of that workflow step and we will prevent the creation of the accepted workflow step. That was the agreement that we reached out that day. And after that, we have heard concerns of a firm which raised to us that we should somehow be able to cancel an accepted workflow step. And their point was that, for example, we could be creating an accepted workflow step for error because, for example, we create an accepted workflow step with a counterparty that doesn't exist. And then we will need to somehow be able from the CDM to cancel that accepted workflow step without having to terminate and legally finish the trade. Because as in this example, for example, we wouldn't be having this trade with another firm to formally terminate it. So we would need to somehow withdraw that accepted workflow step. And this was their concern. So we wanted to raise it here to the group to know your thoughts and if you agree that we may need to find a way to cancel an accepted workflow step, or maybe it's something that is really out of the scope and we shall have the support for that.
I'm not sure we should cancel it. I think we should be able to correct it. But because it's been accepted, regardless of the fact that maybe there was a typo or an error or something that was done that was wrong, it means that the parties to the trade have accepted that they've done that transaction. So I don't think we should cancel it. But I think the scenario you evoked is not that they are trying to cancel the trade. It's just that they are trying to correct something to it. And that I think should be legit to correct once it's accepted.
Yeah, this leads me to a question that would be, when we have an accepted workflow step, is it because both parties have accepted the proposed event, or it is just enough if one of the parties accept it?
It depends. It depends. No, but it depends there are trading scenarios where you need like a pairing and matching, and then you have a confirmation. And you have some scenarios where you have just an affirmation, where effectively you have one party that affirms that this is the trade and that's it. So it's going to and that's going to be depending on the type of product, the trading venue, what their rulebook is. There are going to be many scenarios. So both are legitimate.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, because at the point that we had an affirmation, I think that was their concern. So if we accept, let's say, like unilaterally the proposed event and we create the accepted one, what happens if then we realize that trade, not that we have committed a mistake like a typo, but what happens if we realize that trade doesn't exist anymore, that we have created a trade that not it's not real? From a CDM perspective, how could we withdraw that trade? And it would be a case where it wouldn't be needed to report. So it would be like just removing the trade, I think, if we report in C++, I think.
Okay. So that's two separate scenarios. In one scenario, it was a correction to a trade that was accepted, and in the second scenario, it's properly like a canceling a trade that was previously accepted because it was accepted in error or something. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I don't see any reason why not. But maybe for the cancellation scenario, maybe it needs a bit more to be a bit tighter. In the case you just mentioned, which is it's only in the case where the trade has only been affirmed. So effectively one party has affirmed it. Otherwise, if both have paired and matched, then does anyone know of any trading scenario where when that is the case, then you can still go and cancel the trade? I don't know any.
Yeah.
That would have to,
No.
to me, that would
Not
have to be
It's a real world example.
It does happen. Did you say?
I'm saying it's a real world example where trades get agreed to and executed, and then they can be canceled.
Agreed to by both parties.
Yeah.
They have to be canceled by both parties too.
It has to be canceled. Of course, it has to be canceled by both parties, but it is a real world example. Yes.
Okay. Well, then we have our answer.
Yeah. So,
There is no reason why you shouldn't be able to either correct or cancel a trade that has previously been accepted. Yeah, with the safeguards that you just mentioned, like both parties have to accept it, obviously.
yeah. The model doesn't enforce. This is the question that comes in, is when you want to put in specific workflow requirements, right? You almost have to create your own conditions, right? Because we don't require like acceptance, approval, or rejection as being required, right? It's very flexible to allow you to use it. But in a case, there's certainly a lot of other cases where a workflow step could get canceled because it just didn't occur, right? The model may reflect it occurred, but it actually didn't occur. Or it was agreed that the state or the step should be canceled, right? And then you have to cancel that state. So I think it's not a question of if you're going to do cancel, it's up to an implementation model to say you have to cancel it, and you may have to accept the cancellation. You may have to then replace the cancellation with a new state. These are a lot of workflow steps that you would have to implement through more at the implementation layer than you can in the model at this point.
Okay, no, I think that you're absolutely right, Tom, that I don't think the CDM can really, like this is up to every sort of trading scenario, trading venue, rule book of what you can and cannot do. The CDM cannot attempt to try and replicate all of those. So these need to be implementation concern, it should provide the support with that enumeration of what the possible states are. So that someone can implement their rulebook, but it shouldn't try and prescribe that rulebook because they can be very different from venue to venue. So I think that would argue for relaxing quite a lot of those conditions if they are currently in the way.
Yeah, I mean, my again, this is a topic for discussion, is those rule books or those, let's say in our case, we try to implement best practices guides, right? So it would say that before you book your trade or something, you have to have a confirmation, these kinds of things. Confirmations have to be accepted, or you have to have a proposed change, and that has to be accepted before you make change. These are rules or best practices. The conceptual part of this is whether the CDM could be extended to allow you to create these pre-prescribed workflows, and then users could actually pick up a prescribed workflow model that has been put into the CDM and use that model and implement that. And that would have more restrictions on what the states could be and what the requirements would be from moving from one state to the next state.
I think it's a very good suggestion. So the basics of the model doesn't provide any restriction. It just provides the enumeration to support it. And then pre-canned is a set of menu of workflows where those are restricted in certain ways, which the user can just take as is, or they can use the basic one and build on it. Yeah.
Yeah, imagine a scenario where you actually implement the workflow from the beginning of starting a trade, and you send that workflow object or store it or send it to a counterparty. The expectation would be that the counterparty picks up that object, which is a workflow state. There's with steps, and that next step would be defined within the workflow to say, oh, it has to be accepted. So the only option for the counterparty to do anything, because these are immutable objects, the only option for the counterparty to do something would be to then say, oh, the next state that I can execute is that it has to be accepted or rejected. And that would then change the state of the object that both counterparties would be sharing, either through some kind of central database or through messaging back and forth, but you wouldn't be able to act on it until that actual state change took place.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I agree. I think that if I understood correctly, your proposal, Tom, was that if we had the full view of these workflow step states, in that case, we could be able to control better how are these workflow steps approved and prevent this situation of having an accepted one, which is not correct one, let's say. Is this?
Yes, yeah, exactly. I'm saying the model right now has a lot of flexibility, but we could think about how we could implement what workflow steps are allowed, and in some cases, cancellation of a workflow step should be allowed. There are a lot of scenarios for that.
And there's a tricky component where if we're making a flexible model less flexible, we need to be confident that there's no way around the less flexible. For the example that was in my head was, if you're clearing, you can't cancel the trade, right? You can have an offset trade, but you can't cancel it. And for that matter, each of the clearing venues may have their own specific. So I think Tom's point to aim to chipping away at specific workflows, rule book driven workflows or best practice driven workflows makes a lot of sense, as long as the first comment is supportive, meaning if a clear trade can't be canceled, but the model allows cancellation, we need to be really confident that there's no way around that requirement. But awesome suggestion.
Yeah, no, and it just gets a little more complicated that you think things, are done when they're not done. But in a clear trade scenario or even settlement instructions, you can issue settlement instructions to SWIFT. What you have is a limitation on the time you have before you could actually cancel that. So you could say, you may say, this trade's cleared. Instructions go to clear the trade, to settle the trade. If the trade actually hasn't hit the cutoff time for settlement, you actually could reverse the settlement, or you could actually, in fact, cancel the trade. So there's a one good thing about the model is that it has all these business center times, relevant times, and so on that go on that are set. So if you have rules in there about what cutoff times would be allowed, you could actually implement something where you would say, here's the rule, here's the condition. If I haven't hit the cutoff time, then I still can cancel it. And that would be an accepted workflow event.
Would that be? Yeah, and I think the point is it's going to really vary by rule book. If you've got a clear trade in OTC derivatives trade and it's been accepted, you can't cancel it. There's no, so I think the point that you raised is really great, that what could well evolve from as a future state is a set of rulebook implementations, and say, okay, if you want the package of, I don't know, LCH interest rate swap clearing, here you go. If you want the package of US Treasury clearing, here you go. And there's confidence that the workflows that are defined are immutably correct for the venue.
Is it that way around? Or should we be proposing in CDM effectively a universal rule book and encouraging the people to follow it?
Sorry, what's your question,
So that we were proposing a universal rule book effectively, and then the venues should adopt the CDM event model as opposed to the CDM event model representing specific venues, specific rules.
If you want my 2 cents, I think from where CDM is today, it's probably going to be follow the event rule books. Yeah. If there's logical inconsistency that we discover in that implementation, then you can propose it to the venues. And if there's rationalization across the venues, that's a whole other possibility. It seems to me banks and FMIs are going to have, or banks, actual end users of the product of the products themselves are going to have more influence with the venues to change their behavior than the CDM implementation community. But
I agree. We're going to be very venue. We're going to be very venue dependent. What trading platform you're on, what clearing firm you're using, what settlement system, what CSD, all these become very dependent, or the CDM would be very dependent on implementing those models.
Yeah, just in the interest of time, maybe to sum up what has been discussed. So 2 takeaways is, number 1, in terms of the baseline that the CDM provides, maybe we need to revisit some of those validation conditions as being too restrictive and leave them. And the second branch of the suggestion is, should the CDM provides at least not a complete, but a beginning of a subset of more restrictive rule books where those conditions get added back, more as a guide for implementers for how they could implement theirs. And then ideally over time, venues could potentially publish their rule books in that form as, here is the way I'm extending the CDM to add those additional validation conditions. but maybe we give a starting point with some pre-canned, relatively simple, more restrictive set of workflows in the CDM.
So in that case,
All right, go ahead.
yes, sorry. So in that case, I understand that if we make the CDM more flexible, then the cancellation of an accepted workflow step would be possible, and it would be the rule book, the one who would restrict under which circumstances can we apply that cancellation to an accepted one. Is that right?
And the only caveat, Leo, that I would suggest is that it may be to the community to extend those templates to something that's accurate for a particular venue, rather than necessarily relying upon the venue to publish its rulebook in CDM.
Yeah, no, agreed. I was thinking the former, but then over time, it even opens up to the possibility that the venues may eventually even publish that themselves. But yeah, initially, they absolutely.
A bit like DRR, a process of digitizing venue rulebooks, which could be done by the community and ultimately the venues could own. There's a few people with raised hands. I see Chris.
Hi there. Yeah, I was just going to reference when you actually accept a workflow step, that will convert the proposed event to a business event if you're using the function in the model. So it's not really about cancelling an accepted workflow step. You're actually cancelling a business event as well. So it's a little bit more complex than just changing the workflow step, I believe. So it just needs to be considered when we're looking at this.
Yeah. My only point again was, and this would require a change, is that workflow steps don't require business event.
Yeah, it's just when you use the actual accept workflow step function, it does create the business event. That's the only thing. Just need to make sure we handle when you're canceling it, what actually are you canceling?
Just to follow on from this proposal on the model of the rule books, I think that probably the best thing is to consider it is that you actually can model these, right? So potentially this would be some extension of the some extension of Rune to allow you to model what those rule books are, meaning that the conditions around steps and what steps take place and what conditions are involved. If you want to actually implement that in the sense that actually it will be a part of the code generation process, it would then require modeling it, some probably additions to the Rune language in order to do that modeling. So that's just an added note to the potential topic if we discuss it.
Yeah, I would have thought that we do have the logic elements to do that, but if you have some examples in mind that you can share, that would be great.
It needs to have the same provenance as well that we have in DRR, linking back effectively functions and condition statements also to rules in a rule book.
Yeah. Yes. But so I meant we can take this one offline, but if you have some suggestion, Tom, that's great.
I think has got his hand up.
Yeah, so not related to the cancellation or venue workflow, but I was thinking more on the structured trades, right? Where multi-leg structured trades within interest rate derivatives. So I was trying to say, is there any thought process put around for the handling the multi-leg structures? Yeah, sometimes it's two different asset classes also, right? Now within the same asset class, you have different products, but no could be multi-leg.
What is your question? Do we have specific workflows and business events?
Yeah,
Multi-leg
Yeah,
product?
be it it's a combination of product and the business event, right? To handle the multi-leg structure. So if you have, say, 3 different trades in one structure, or no, multiple trades, and one of them can getting cancelled or no amended, so we need to handle that because product or business events. I didn't explore fully to see if there are any materials available on GitHub already. If not, maybe this is something that we need to add to the community to put more thought process into it.
By multi-leg product, are you referring to, let's say, package transactions or something else?
Multi-leg, right? So you can have cap and floor linked to a fixed load swap. I don't know, some other products also, right? The combination of 2 products.
Okay, yeah, so that's a package. There isn't anything specific for multi-leg in the sense that the event model is, let's say, independent or orthogonal to the product representation. But yeah, I don't know, maybe you have a specific scenario in mind.
Okay, maybe I'll write it down and send it to you guys. We can discuss later that. Yeah, it's a combination of, one scenario is a package trade where, you have the complex trade ID linked all around. And then other one is you don't have a package, but still a multi-leg structure. I'll give you the scenarios.
Yeah, just a word of note that this, as I'm sure you can expect, this discussion around package transaction brought us a lot of joy in the context of digital regulatory reporting, how they should be reported, how to capture the attributes correctly, etc. So there is a ample history on how those are represented, but eventually got there in terms of reporting the right package transaction attributes in the context of DRR. So yeah, I think those have been discussed quite extensively in that context.
Okay.
No specific workflow concept for package transaction. That's right.
And sorry, stupid question. When we say no specific workflow for packages, if it's a credit, let's say a credit specific, an intertrade swap with a credit with the potential for credit cancellation, is that modeled, or is that up to the implementers to model? Does that make sense? Let's say an intertrade swap, which will cancel on a credit event.
I'm not sure I got the question, Dan. I'm sorry.
That's all right. Supposing we have an interest rate swap that has cancellation protection, that has credit protection. And so it automatically cancels on a credit event. It's essentially, it's a structured trade of some nature, not too structured in the realm of structure. Are the economics modeled today, or is that something that someone has to implement the economics?
Yeah, I think I know what you're referring to now. So that's the optional early termination and the mandatory early termination, typically in the case of ratings trigger. So this information is captured at the level of the product, but there is no specific, that I know of, there is no specific business event that has been implemented to actually represent the triggering of one of those and the subsequent termination.
Okay, thank you. So, yeah, sorry, my question was a little confusing. That's pretty much my usual state at 8 a.m. Can I suggest that it seems like we're collecting lots of open issues, questions. And again, I didn't join the beginning. How are we collating them? Is the expectation that individuals submit them as a list and there'll be a master list, or that there's a central collection going on as we go? How are we dealing with that?
So we'll try to, this is LITEC, we'll try to summarize the discussions and provide a list before the next meeting. I think I noticed that some of the discussions that we're having would be part of the roundtable that we were planning to have towards the end of the call. So I suggest maybe we get back on track and go through the feedback that were received from different people. And before I do that, I just wanted to check with Trade Header if all their questions had been answered or handled.
Yes, I think that from our side, we are good. Thank you so much for the feedback. We will work further in the analysis, given your views.
Before we go to Tom, I just wanted to mention some additional feedback that we had received from a prospective bank, at least one. They were, before they implement a CDM, they were, I guess, concerned, or they were interested in making sure that if they do implement CDM, that does it ensure interoperability with other firms? So essentially, that's a question about workflow orchestration and interoperability. And I think that ties back to, I think, what Tom was talking about earlier. So I just wanted to raise that to make sure that that's not only an issue for current users of the CDM, but also for users that are considering CDM and are looking at the model. So let me go back to.
Sorry, that's like the $20 million question, right? But I think embedded in that is a question about major version management. Meaning, if you're on, I think it at least ought to be constrained to major version management. Sorry, let me step back. To me, there's really two questions. One is, what does it mean? What does the handshake mean if a firm's adopted CDM? And have they adopted for data modeling? Have they adopted for event modeling? And so on, workflows, et cetera. There's a question there. And secondly, there's a question about a more technical question about a firm. What do we mean in terms of consistent? If a firm has adopted for a major version and another firm has adopted for the same major version, do we have confidence that they'll work? And also, what happens when we go from major version to major version? Meaning, can we break workflows? Which I think the answer is yes. It's a $20 million question, maybe more than that, multi-billion-dollar question. What does it mean for a firm to adopt CDM?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. We turn it over to Tom Healy from IGMA. Tom?
Yeah, Gary, thanks, Litek. Yeah, actually, the second item, before I get back to the first item, so we did, I think, cover the topic on the second one, that the workflow design that I was proposing here was to discuss the requirements for how we would actually implement workflow designs, meaning prescribed workflow designs, or has been described, rule books and so on. So I think we've touched upon that. Maybe there'll be follow-up discussion on the open workshop later, but that was essentially the second item that I wanted to raise. The first item that I want to raise is that one extension I would suggest to the model is that currently business events and workflows are all really designed mostly around trade events, but there's a lot of other objects at lower levels within the CDM that could persist. And yet, if you want to make changes to them, you really don't have an event model in order to make those changes. As an example, if you simply have to make a change to a party, it could be updating their contact information, or it could be updating if, let's say, they had a different LEI or an additional identifier, all these kinds of things at lower level objects that you may create and persist. We really don't have a model where you can actually go about executing those changes in the same way that you can execute changes to trades. So you want to know, you want the traceability the auditability of knowing what changed. And you want to, many of these objects are immutable, so you really don't have any other way of changing them other than to create a new one and link them to some way through yourself. But if you want to use the model to do it, you need some method in the model and possibly some instruction set that you would pass in to go ahead and make changes on these lower level objects. So not everything, my point, I guess, is not everything should be tied to a trade. Even if you think about doing other types of events, transfers, payments, things like that, they're not all related to actual trade events, especially where trades get netted or disconnected from the other events that may take place. I just wanted to raise this as, again, a workflow topic or a workshop topic, maybe to be discussed later. And if there's anyone that has run into this as a challenge or a problem for them to maintain persistent objects from the CDM, just curious what we certainly, this is something I've run into a number of times and had to deal with it by working around it. I just wanted to raise this to see if it's a priority for others, and maybe we can add it onto the open discussion later on.
Apart from like addresses changing or something, what other use cases do you see this being used with?
Just the party would be one object that would get changed. Transfers, potentially, what is disconnected from the actual trade itself. So you want to execute these events independently. There could be business centers or other objects that are heavily used. Those are a few of the ones that I have in mind.
Tom, I also have a use case actually been looking at very recently. The idea is to have an operational level agreement between parties. So it would be like a definition of a product, and then you would actually say how certain aspects of that product would actually be agreed between the parties. So it's not actually a legal agreement, so it wouldn't be tied to something like a contract formation. It's a completely separate event of forms, but it's also not a business event per se, so it wouldn't be tied to the trade. So yeah, this is very topical for me because it's exactly what I've been looking at as well. The only way that we could actually implement what I'm looking to do would be to tie what I'm looking to do to a business event. So if we can do it without having to actually use a business event, not tie it to a trade, then that would be ideal. Yeah. So this is good stuff.
Yeah, I think I just thought about that. That's a good case. So related to that one would be something like a collateral schedule, right? So collateral schedules and things get updated or changed many times. They're not really trade-related events. It would be good to have other ways of defining instructions so that you can actually go ahead and change these objects. Like I said, if you worked with it, they're immutable. You shouldn't be going in and manipulating it in some other way. The idea is that you actually go through a regular process of defining what the change is going to be and then run through some change event that we've defined. So those were the big ones that I had. Those were the non-trading events. I think would be, if I had to prioritize in terms of maybe things that could be implemented a little bit easier as a first step, the non-trading events would, I think, be first and more usable. Not that the other's not usable, but this would certainly be something that could immediately be used. The workflow design and orchestration was the other thing we were talking about. That's probably a little more complicated. It requires even more lower level changes. So those were my two. Thanks, Litek.
Thank you, Tom. If there are no comments on Tom's items, I wanted to maybe give Dan the opportunity to maybe see if all his input had been covered. So Dan had provided like a detailed list. So most of them were perhaps agenda suggestions. But Dan, do you have any outstanding questions that were not addressed?
Yeah, so a little tricky since I joined perhaps when much of the content the material content was covered. So I have to leave it to others who are able to who had joined at the beginning to clarify whether they feel like these items were covered. I'm not certain we talked about what happens if a transition fails. I think we did talk about, or for that matter, what I meant by a transition. I think we may have talked about how to chain. I don't know if we talked about bulk invocations, but that may or may not make sense in the case of it. Yeah, I don't know if we talked about bulk invocation. Sorry, let me stop being scattershot. I'll just, as folks read through this list, if they feel like in the session that I missed, these weren't covered, then need to be, or decided that it doesn't matter. And I think maybe, so 1 through 4 I would have thought were covered. I'm not certain what happens in 5, what happens when it fails. I think we may have touched on how to chain. I don't think there was discussion. I heard discussion of bulk invocations. And it seems to me arguably Tom's observation is 8.
I can give you some advice on some of the top ones. So in terms of in the workflow step, you've got the concept of approvals. And this is, I think, you can approve, or each party can approve a workflow step. So when you create the proposed event, that could be a point in time in which whatever you're building your platform or whatever, allows the use of an entity approving that proposed event. In terms of the transition failing, there is a function called create rejected workflow step. And that sets the rejection flag in the workflow step, which is just a flag to say that it wasn't accepted. It didn't turn into a business event. In terms of how the platform then handles that rejection, I guess is up to you. But that is a method for effectively flagging a trade has failed. Whether it should have failed or not, I don't know.
Yeah. So I guess the short of it, LeTech, is since I missed the first session, I don't feel like I have much of a claim on whether these questions were answered. I can certainly look when the materials are circulated. I'll look through and see if it seems like they were discussed or ask for additional information.
Yeah, I don't think we discussed transitions or transition failure. We didn't discuss bulk invocations.
And so then there's a question. We started to talk about, or we talked about some of the events that are currently supported. And I assume that's CDM7. When I went looking for the event enum, intent enum, and this is where I got confused. Apologies about allocation. Allocation is there. Affirmation and confirmation were removed, but there's a workflow status enum that says accepted and rejected. It has unconfirmed, which I guess is somewhat confusing. Oh, it has unconfirmed and confirmed and unaffirmed. So maybe that's where those get sorted. Sorry, trying to go back to there you go. 1 second. Sorry. Just would be good to do an inventory of what's supported, what's not supported, and so on, or if it was already done. And a clarification on I think in Lionel's presentation, there was a good sense for for the ones that were presented for what the inputs were and what the outputs were, but it would be good to have it for all the supported events. And also how error states are handled in the case of where something's missing. Again, this was intended not as a set of open questions, but more, could we make certain that the sessions covered these topics? And so I'm not, having joined in late, I get some sense, I think some of the events that were supported were covered, not all of them. And I think that there was some clarity on inputs and outputs, but maybe not as much as one would hope.
Yeah, thanks. That thing would also be interesting to find out from the audience is whether some of the items that Dan listed here are of interest to them. So if there are any points that Dan just discussed or has listed on the screen that are of interest to your firm, please let us know. This way we can prioritize that work to close the gaps or to support additional processes.
And Litek, just to play back, so I'm hopeful that in the earlier session, there was a clarity on what is the event intent enum, how is that used, and what is the workflow status enum, how is that used? And then there's a discussion about take affirm and confirm. Is that really a workflow status or is that an event? And if it's a workflow status, what does it mean? Or are those used? I can see how accepted and rejected, submitted, those all seem like atomic states, which is what I would assume workflow status ought to be. But some of these others, although they may be supporting DRR and therefore urgent, seem like they're more events than they are workflow status. Like affirmed and confirmed seems to me naively seems like an event, not a workflow status.
Chris, go ahead.
Thanks, Litek. Yeah, I concur with Dan. I think, and Georgina actually raised this earlier too. I think there is a little bit of ambiguity around workflow step because you've got the workflow status. I think then you've got an action status. You've got the approval as well. So I think some consolidation around those enums, because we probably don't need all of them. It'd be worth deciding which ones we do need and what they actually mean. Because we could be cancelling an event. We could be cancelling a workflow step, could be cancelling the entire workflow. What they actually apply to, so the context of each of those enums, I think is important to get right. Something else that I think has been raised a few times as well, and I think Dan's got on here as well, is really about cancellations. So is it cancellation of the trade, talking about a termination, cancelling a business event, amendment to a business event? I think those sort of things we need a little bit more discussion around as well. Something that Lionel mentioned earlier was about settlement as well, and how settlement was actually available in the model. I actually disagree with that. I think the transfers are there. You can transfer cash, you can transfer security. But the actual concept of the settlement, especially from a security lending perspective, I don't think has really been covered yet, because how do you actually determine if the trade has been settled? Well, it depends on the collateral type and what's actually been transferred. So I think there's possibly more qualification functions required, but there's still a bit more work to complete, I guess, the security lending lifecycle, which again comes to Tom's point about we need to implement workflows that essentially are the best practice for different product types. So this is a very good thing that we're doing here, actually having these discussions and working out what needs to be done. That was it. Thanks, Litek.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Any input? Yeah.
So Litek, I just would say that the gap assessment that I noted, that in some respects, that's what would drive what it seems to me each of the 4 groups have talked about in terms of feedback. And then against that, let's prioritize where we're going to assess that there are gaps and then prioritize where we're going to implement gaps. But even talking about whether an interest rate swap with credit terms has the product implementation seems even that may, if I understood correctly, that may be a gap, which it'd just be good to be able to begin to understand what's there, what's not there.
All right, better. It's noted, Dan. Any more input from anyone? All right, Brad. Let me look at the schedule. We're going through the group feedback, and we did that for almost 90 minutes. So I propose we have a short break now, and we're going to eliminate the third break. We're just going to maybe, when we come back from the break, there's one last set of feedback from that Regnosis collected. So we want to go through these. Maybe we'll need 30 minutes, 40 minutes. That will bring us to 5:20, which for the roundtable. During the roundtable, we'll go through the room and see if there are additional feedback from anyone that we haven't heard from. So that will be the chance to gather that feedback. And then we'll conclude, we'll try to conclude at 5:30 unless there's a lot of heated debate. So we do have the webinar until 6 p.m.
Yeah, and the group I will one go through now.
That's correct, yes.
If I can come to keep mine under 30 minutes, then we can recover a 10-minute break. I'll try and do that.
So you do want to have the break now, a break now?
Yeah, let's have it now anyway.
All right.
I'll try to keep mine short.
Okay, very good. Let's reconvene in 10 minutes at 4:38. Thank you. All right, we're starting in 2 more minutes. Right, so this is what the schedule looks like. We're going to finish the group feedback with items from Regnosis, 30 minutes. No more break. Number 3, we'll have a roundtable for about 30 minutes. If there's any additional input from people around the table. And then if all goes well, we can wrap up around 5:45. And yeah, so let me open the feedback that Regnosis collected. And I'm going to turn it over to Leo.
Hey, so am I on? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thanks, Litek. So I think I have 4 or 5. So I'm going to try to keep it under 30 minutes. So number 1 was regarding quantity change. This is more of a collation of defects that have been raised by a number of participants some in recent contribution review working group, some were a little bit earlier. Those have effectively been grouped together under the GitHub issue, which is, there's a link on the slide. But the idea was, should we just take a step back and rethink the primitive breakdown, which is part of what Lionel was saying in his earlier presentation. It current breakdown into primitive events represents the current picture. This is what has been developed organically over time, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't or can't change it. There were a few suggestions that were made on that issue already. I think Chris and others chime in on the fact that should quantity change be commingled with price change and effectively challenging that. The reason that they are commingled together is because in the model, price and quantity go together. But should we revisit that and at least regarding changing them, should we separate that out? And potentially there is a need for more granular quantity change operations. As part of this discussion, what I would like as a group to put back on the table is the question of termination. The way a termination currently works is when a quantity has been reduced to 0, then it's deemed a termination. And back in the earlier days of the CDM, there was, let's say, considerable debate and back and forth between is a termination the result of a quantity going to 0, or should it be the other way around, which is, should we think of a termination as really a primitive event in its own right, and it does mean that the quantity of the concerned position goes to 0. That debate was settled in a way. This was implemented in the CDM. If we are rethinking of the quantity change and a certain number of issues, defects were raised, like throwing my hat into the ring, I think that question should be put potentially back for re-examination, whether that decision at the time should not be re-examined in the light of new evidence that we have. So that's about number 1. Since I said that I was collating issues that were raised by others, I'm going to just make a quick pause here if anyone wants to chime in on that.
Yeah, Leo, you said that there was a decision taken about quantity change to 0 and termination.
Yeah.
What was it? Apologies.
Yeah, it's what is currently implemented in the CDM, which is you don't have a primitive event called termination. In fact, what you have is you have a quantity change primitive event. And then when that as a result of that quantity change, the quantities goes to zero, then it is deemed a termination. So it's a consequence of bringing the quantity to zero. So that's what's currently implemented. There is no such primitive event as a termination event.
Okay. And so whether there's a primitive or there's something that uses quantity change, there needs to be a clearly defined, it seems to me, a clearly defined business there is a clearly defined business activity called termination. So it seems like arguably then it's more of an what you're asking, sorry to be slow, is an implementation question. Do we need a primitive called termination event, or do we have something that's a higher order that is called termination event, which leads to uses quantity change to set it to zero?
Yeah, no, that's correct. But it's first point you're making, which is it an implementation problem? It is firmly a modeling problem.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, but your second statement is absolutely right.
Yeah, sorry. My language was a little different. I meant implementation of the model, not programming, not something outside of the model. So yeah, modeling question. Agreed.
Chris, you have your hand up.
Thanks, Leo. Yeah, just wanted to say I fully support the change of taking a quantity change and moving it away from a price change. So at the moment, we do have quantity change, and I believe it's just called that because it's acting on the price quantity. So really, I would suggest that, if we had a primitive that was a quantity change, a primitive that was a price change, because there are very different reasons for doing both, I think that would make a lot of sense. So I think that's a really good change.
I think it was, I may have not represented the truth correctly when I said the only reason why they are together in the same primitive is because the object itself, price, quantity, they go together. The reason why they are together is also because when you're making let's say an increase, for instance, or a decrease for that matter, if you make an increase, then you not only do you have to specify the quantity by which you increase, but you also have to specify the price at which you do it. And similarly, when you do a decrease, not only do you have to specify how much you decrease by, but you also have to specify some sort of termination price. So that's the reason why they were together, but it still raises a question as to whether they rightly belong to the same primitive or whether they should be separated still. So anyway, that's the reason.
Yeah, from a rate change perspective on a securities lending change, if it's not using index rate, then that would just be a price change. So you wouldn't want to call something called quantity change in order to effect a price change. So I think logically it disambiguates them. So I still think, I can see your use case, but I think there's other use cases for just a price change on its own as well. Thank you.
Alston?
Yep. Yeah. Hi. So my question was back again to what I was asking Lion about with respect to quantity change for something simple as an FX forward. Was it intentionally that when there is an increase that you keep adding trade lots? As for example, an FX contract would just be one contract. And if, say, for just our example is, say, if there's a fat finger correction and there is a change in the event, and what happens is, if we want that trade lot itself to be increased rather than creating another trade lot. So in that case, at this point, I can only see that I have to explicitly specify that I'm going to replace, and the direction should be replaced, and then only will I, was it intentionally to create multiple lots, or is there something which can be done to put as a default setting, or I think it should be some guideline on it?
The reason, so the trade lots were introduced, and clearly the name betrays where it's coming from. It was introduced in the context of equity swaps, where you do have that concept of lots. And effectively, every time you do an increase, it is meant to be a different lot, but you would want to do it on the same trade. So that concept was introduced for that specific use case, which typically isn't used anywhere else in other asset classes. So in retrospect, it was introduced, 4-5 years ago, something like that. And I think we probably owe it to the CDM to look at it retrospectively and think whether this was the right way of handling that particular issue, or should it be done in a certain way? Because exactly as you said, for all other asset classes, you don't have that concept, and effectively you increase, decrease on the same trade. You don't have that concept of lot. So I was thinking equities, the term in that space is a tax lot, right? And that's specifically for taxing purposes, but it's really only used in that context. So in other words, like all other asset classes implement it in a way where they don't create new trade lots. It's all done on one single trade lot. Okay, if there's no more question on this, I'll move to workflow step. Some of this has been discussed in the rest of the session, but effectively just to note that this is a structure that has evolved organically and could benefit from being streamlined. So I noted a few examples. The first one is about the rejected attributes, which is redundant versus there is an enum about the status, which also has rejected or rejection. So this is redundant. Business event versus proposed event. It's effectively the same structure. It's just that you have additional attributes in business events. But if we are just have some relaxation of the corresponding attribute in business event, then we could handle it with just one attribute. So that would simplify the model. The event timestamp qualification enum. It's an enum that is mixing really different dimensions. One is the type of event, like clearing, confirmation, etc. And the second one is a workflow status. So the suggestion I would have is to retire that enum to only have an enumeration for the workflow status, which already is there, and make the timestamp single cardinality instead of multiple cardinality. So effectively, a workflow step is associated to a timestamp and is associated to a type of, and the type of workflow step tells you what the qualification for that timestamp. So it makes the model a lot more constrained. Pausing there, just if there is any question or comment on that. Okay, so I'll move on. Again, we touched on intent enum. Our observation is that this enum has been abused. Effectively, the big risk that is being run right now is that it loses the composability, the duality of composability and qualification in the model. Effectively, the risk is using the enum as a crutch for not having a proper qualification based on what the components are. Really, that we only need an enum to delineate events that are otherwise logically indistinguishable. We shouldn't use the enum to say upfront what an event is. And in a lot of cases, that has been introduced where effectively the qualification logic just looks at the intent and says, oh, I know what event it is. It's given to me by the intent, as opposed to doing the work of actually qualifying based on what the components are. So, like, my suggestion is that we should take a really long, hard look at that intent enum and potentially take a knife and remove a lot of those values and make sure that we are able to qualify those events logically looking at the components. Any question on that or comment?
Leo, this is Dan again. It seems to me, and maybe this is what you're aiming at, is there's a potential blurring between the intention for some of these events, so event intent and workflow status enums seem there could be a refactoring to say, okay, the way I look at workflow status, it's more about some atomic states. And the way I look at event intent, it's more about the, I'm not going to speak in CDM terms, but the overall business intent. So accepted, rejected, for example, those are atomic states of a workflow. I'm not certain. Clear doesn't seem like an atomic event. And so maybe, and I guess at the end of my dithering, my question to you is what you're suggesting that we ought to relook at CDM event, enums related to workflow and decide which are what are the categories, and do we have the right elements in each of the categories, meaning atomic, things that are specific to workflow, business activities, and so on.
I think if I understood your question right, what I would say is, yes, taking a look at the separation that was intended in the CDM between business event or life cycle event, i.e. something that changes the state of a trade. And the intent was to clearly separate that from workflow concern, which is all the nitty-gritty of an actual implementation where we're going to have to say, oh, but for this particular business event, we're going to need some confirmation process where, where the two parties have to agree, or if it's clearing, then we're going to need to have all those parties involved in the chain to agree, all those things, and those can occur at different times, etc. Separating all of that out and put that in the workflow and not have business event worry about any of those. So that was the intent of the separation. And effectively, the implementation in the model of timestamps, enums, etc., should reflect what was intended. And that's some elements have been introduced that blur those lines. And the suggestion is to really make it very strict and stringent in the model and to reflect what the way in which it was intended.
But I would, all right, go ahead, Tom.
It's actually Ian.
Sorry, Ian.
Right.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, it's about making it more efficient. I think the result of making it more efficient is that the model is probably going to be smaller and therefore a bit stricter. Yes.
And it really seems to me like you're talking about three different types of information. One is the atomic details around all workflow activities. And I come back, accepted, rejected, sent. That seems atomic. Two is a collection of business events that are supported. And three, whether at a primitive level or a higher level. And three is the data that any of those business events require as input or output or generate as output. And that partition would seem to aim the model to be most flexible and most efficient, arguably.
Yeah.
Do I? Right.
Like how to use it, because just by looking at it, where you use a workflow for, what you use an event for, and it's very clear.
Yes. Agreed.
Okay. So moving on, number 4 is reset versus observation. This is something that was recently reported by Fragmos and captured also in a sort of umbrella issue. But yeah, there is an opportunity to rationalize here. I just wanted to put some history behind it. Historically, and I think I made that remark in Lionel's session earlier. The reset came first. It was meant to represent an observation that impacts the cash flow on a trade. It was done at a time when the scope in terms of product of the CDM was much smaller. Therefore, the focus was on interest rate payout, which is where it is now. Later on, the observation event was developed, but even that observation event is still incomplete. So I think we should probably take the reset and observation and effectively make them eventually cover what they need to cover and across asset classes. So I think hence the reason why there is some confusion when people come at it for the first time and look at resets and say, oh, it only covers that type of payout. Why is that? So explaining it more clearly that it only covers a subset. Sorry, pausing there before I move on to what I think is the last one. If there is any comment on this number 4.
Yeah, just quickly on that one, Leo. So the reset, as you say, actually, I think JB's approach seems to be to separate out observation and reset. And I think there's merit in that because the observation is what actually causes the reset. Yeah, what could generate a reset? A reset is also something, certainly from my perspective, that is actually scheduled, whereas an observation is a market thing that can happen at any time, a market event. So I think having them separate does make sense. I agree. This is a good thing to do. It's just quite a heavy lift, I think, involved in that one.
Yeah. Okay. Any more comment on that one? Okay. So I'll move on to the last. Touched upon it when Georgina discussed trade headers comments, but it's about trade versus counterparty position and also their affiliated components, business event versus counterparty position, business event. So counterparty position is something that was developed tactically for ETD reporting in EMIR, where the reporting is done at the aggregate position level. But what we ended up developing is effectively a parallel structure to trade, which meant that the event model had to be duplicated as well for position. And since then, there was work last year with the asset refactoring that effectively laid the groundwork for separating transferable or fungible products versus the non-transferable or contractual sorts. So potentially we could revisit counterparty position in light of this development that was done later. So effectively, is there a way by which we can improve the current situation where we have those two structures developed in parallel and where there is a bit more commonality between them at least? And that's it. There any question or comment on the last point?
Is there a broad review of the counterparty business, the extensions to business event that this is a subcategory of? Because there was also something mentioned earlier, a business timestamp business event. I forget the name. I'm just wondering whether there's a refactoring analysis that might make sense.
Yeah,
It's
maybe
a broader category.
Yeah, all of these are potentially areas of discussion for effective for the next step in this workshop, which is there things that we need to adjust, change, etc., where there is an opportunity to rationalize the model. So that's one of them. But yeah, I think this one is separate from the timestamp consideration from earlier.
Thanks.
Okay. I kept mine short.
That's it. All right. Any last questions for Leo? All right. Very good. So we are going to tackle the last session of the day, which is the roundtable. And that this session is really meant to give an opportunity for those who may not have thought yet, or to raise other issues, to essentially provide some feedback or some suggestions about what could be done in CDM to improve usage, to make it easier to implement. So we have 30 minutes And I'm just going to do this organically and maybe leave it open for anyone to unmute and give some input. Are there any areas that people feel strongly about, whether these are improvements that need to be made? Any thoughts from perhaps people that are looking at CDM and want to implement it but can't, or maybe other blockers that other people have and that need to be dealt with urgently? Any long-term opportunities for CDM? George, please go ahead.
Yeah, that's me. Oh, I'm not sure how this will be received. You guys able to hear me? I'm using the Enjoy. Yeah. So,
See, yeah, like I'm not sure how well this appears, but when it's mostly
how some of the observations have been grouped thematically. I feel like there's been a lot of low-level, detailed discussions today, which for somebody who isn't at the coalface developing CDM interactions, whilst I've understood them, it's difficult to derive an overall picture on industry progress.
Sorry, we can't hear.
YouTube could be thematically grouped such that those who are less comfortable or less familiar with some of the initiatives can get a better sort of overall adoption view and see, is it completeness and omission in the data model? Is it about workflows and interaction? I know this session is more focused on workflows. Is it about sequencing and chaining? Is it about interoperability? And where do each of these discussions fit in those themes? And as such, where are we furthest away from implementing at a production level thematically across each of those areas? So I don't know if any of you guys have thoughts on that, if I'm the only one with that sort of view, or if that makes sense.
Sorry, I can't really hear that. Can that be repeated?
No, that's really helpful. And I think just to close the loop on that one, in terms of how each of these discussions contribute towards different areas of the value chain as well in post-trade, some of these questions and discussions are more relevant to, say, reg reporting. Others may be more relevant to the use of CDM in confirmation or cash flow calculation. Each of them have different areas of focus and different consequences. So I think to your point, putting together a full stack life cycle and sort of pinpoint a discussion around each area of value might be more practical.
Can I ask a sort of related question to what you both said? The first 90 minutes or so when I went through the introduction, nearly everything that I said is already in existing documentation. And I might have used one of those aforementioned tools to create my presentation from that documentation. But I think people came to this meeting feeling that they didn't fully understand and they wanted training and explanation. What is it that we might do to generate more stuff? Stuff being a broad term for events, education, training, documentation, samples, as you said. what stuff do people need to use the model more effectively? Gonna point it back to you.
Yeah, I've got a view on that, actually, because I think while CDM is a modernization, a different approach towards standardized processes, those processes in many cases do exist as analogs today. And so drawing a parallel between CDM flows, workflows, dependencies, and how the model is integrated against legacy flows in terms that folks will understand, folks that work in back office or in confirmations team. How does, for example, say a rates confirmation and calculation look from a CDM data perspective? How would you perform those operands to get data versus how is that done in, say, an established platform like Marketplace or something like that today, or any other platform for that matter? It depends what process you're talking about, right? But I think drawing a parallel into the existing processes that CDM would look to either build on, improve, or work adjacent with, at least for me, that would help, I think, in terms of touching and feeling and understanding the different points at which I can compare it to existing system.
But how would you want to consume that?
I think the examples is the best way, but I think drawing it alongside a legacy process to understand, okay, I understand in terms of CDM taxonomy what this event is and what it represents and what it means. But I think it might invoke different sorts of discussions if you were stacking that next to what is the legacy application of that process today.
Dan and others have got hands up.
Yeah, so way back when we cycled through each of our collection of questions, to me, this is the inventory question, meaning there's a set of activities which CDM supports to varying maturity today. Can we make that lit? One of the ways that would be helpful to me anyway, Lionel, to answer your question, is make that list of those events, that business events that are supported, and be able to drill through and see what's input, what's expected from input and output. And then I think it's some community assessment of how mature that is, meaning how comprehensive the support is for that event. And I appreciate that the events may be supported ex post from a reporting perspective. I think the other question is to be able to be used as part of a workflow, not after it's already happened. And I think that that kind of inventory would help then drive where people want to augment or refactor to get to be more mature. So refactor would be to get to more mature, and augment would be, oh, why isn't this event supported? I'm going to have that trying to support it.
So yeah, I realize I made a point and no one can hear it. But all I was saying was around the examples, that maybe we should have examples to be able to illustrate this, which actually Dan has made the point about an inventory. And that's all that I probably agree with, particularly if we want to go through all the enums related to the workflow and event model and try and highlight what's needed and what's not, or the other bits and pieces, that the best way to do that is going to be develop that inventory, develop examples, run the examples through what we think the workflow would be, and then highlight the gaps or the redundancies. So maybe that's a way forward.
Great. Any other feedback? Any other topic people would like to raise?
So Litek, when we think about the next session, like what's the structure that, and maybe this is an offline conversation, but what's the structure for that next session? Do we start with the inventory or start with or discussion about opportunities for modeling efficiency and an inventory of existing workflows?
Good question, Dan. So we have the slide that I'm showing on the screen. On day 2, which is scheduled July 9th, we will review the items discussed today and the follow-ups. We will, so Diagnosis will do some work to present perhaps a first draft of the target state for the model and the tentative roadmap for delivery. So we will have another roundtable to gather further comments like we did today, to make sure that we have gathered all the feedback from the community over the 2 days. And from one outcome from this workshop, like the 2 days, is to prioritize the items and develop a roadmap. So the roadmap will look at priorities and the sequencing and dependencies of the different related items. And so it might be like where you might take a look at the items that people feel are more important than others.
But so LeTech experiences.
So to that effect, the gathering of input is not done. Please do send additional comments my way. So there's the email in the invite and on the slide. So there was, I don't know if Prognosis wants to add anything to what I just said.
We're not gonna come and arrive with a proposal. Just to be clear, I think the idea of day 2 is to discuss and gather ideas from the community for how we can potentially go about addressing some of what has been discussed today. And then I think you collect that, and then later on, after that, decisions are being considered whether there are some areas that can be prioritized for some of the work to be done or not. But I think the day 2 is really about turning it back to the community, and I would call that more like ideation rather than coming with a laid out roadmap and saying, hey, what do you think of that? Because I don't think we have started to address how we want to solve those particular issues. There are lots of them that have been raised today. So that's how I would think of day 2.
Would it be fair to say that today has been more about showing people what's there, being honest that, well, some of it actually, or most of it must work because it is being used and people have been successful, but that nothing's set in stone and we can make it more efficient. And maybe the next step is to come with ideas. Maybe people now know that the opportunity is there to genuinely fix and streamline and make it more efficient. So maybe that's the nature of the next session.
So yeah, I think that's participants who've already contributed some of their time today could take the next 2 weeks, which is, the message is, it is what it is today, but it's, as with everything, it's subject to change. And then the next session is going to be about collecting inputs for how we could go about making positive changes in the model, and not necessarily coming from one member or another. Anyway, that's the answer of day 2.
And it would be helpful if you're going to collate input into day 2, if somebody could run point on creating a framework for collating that input, so that when people chime in over the next 2 weeks, it gets in the standard format, or it starts out in the standard format, right? If we're going to do inventory, it's like, here's the list of the business events. Each event, does it have clear defined outcome, intention, the item there? Are the inputs defined? Are the outputs defined? What's its assessment for DRR reporting? Probably check. What's its assessment for parties interacting using the workflow? Question mark. I don't know what the answer is for the latter. Maybe all of those are checked too. I don't know.
All right. Thanks, Dan. I want to thank everybody for their participation today. I think we had a successful workshop.